Welcome back. My name is Baller Scuba. This is Video Games Over Time. We are still in 1982. And today we're going to do a retrospective video. We're going to look back at the year as a whole. We're going to talk about some behind the scenes stuff. We're going to talk about some of my personal experiences. We'll hear from some patrons. We're going to do a whole thing. For those of you that haven't seen these videos before, it is my chance to kind of go a little bit more relaxed. I don't have a script in front of me. I just have notes. With that said, we do have a big year in front of us. 1982 was a huge year, so let's try to get into it. I'm going to try to go quickly, but I say that every year and then it ends up going too long. I'm on my streaming setup right now because it's going to be a lot easier for me. The old setup had technical issues every time I did it, so hopefully things go a little bit easier on my streaming setup. But things are a little different here. You can still see the bookshelf back there. Hopefully everything's on camera there. But yeah, it's still back there. Somebody actually asked what the it's actually a mouse pad, a white mouse pad. What does it say? It actually says "Buy my book." And that's a whole different project for a whole nother time, but there's your answer, Polly. All right, so let's talk about some behind-the-scenes stuff. It's been a long year, and as a result, there had to be breaks. They weren't necessarily breaks that I needed for, like mental health or anything like that. I took a couple breaks because of holidays. We went down to Monterey County in California, which is about a 12-hour drive for the record. We went down for Thanksgiving and Christmas. We went to see Han's family down there. Han's sister has a newborn baby that we wanted to see, so we hung out down there. And as a result, I didn't have time to record or script or anything while I'm driving for 12 hours and hanging out with family for holidays. There were a couple breaks for that. I feel like I'm in the middle of a break right now. This break is due to stress, I'm not going to lie, and it has nothing to do with the channel. But work has been very stressful. It is it's the busiest time of the year for us in the accounting field, and COVID is not helping at all. So we've had 2 people had to take a full week off due to COVID, and we're already short-staffed. So I'm doing what I can to make sure that everything gets done. It's the only time of year that we have an actual hard deadline, really, and there's a lot of things due at the end of the month, and we're trying to make sure all of our clients meet that deadline, and that's not an easy thing to do. So that's work. Home has also been stressful, unfortunately, and it's because there's kitchen repairs that needed to be done. We found out basically that our refrigerator had been leaking. There was a bust in the pipe leading to the fridge. And so there's been 2 weeks worth of construction in our kitchen. And I'm not happy about that. Not happy with any aspect of it right now. And so we'll talk about that probably in a different video. I'll try to make it funny and make it entertaining. Try to get something positive out of this experience. And people seem to enjoy kind of the personal video sometimes. So we'll do a separate video for that if you are interested. So let's get back kind of to the channel itself, which is, there's a couple things that I wanted to talk about. Number one, copyright. Copyright's been an issue really for everybody on YouTube lately. It did hit me as well. There were issues at the beginning. Remember that I wanted to play clips of the number 1 songs of the year in my YouTube videos for the cultural context videos. That's what I call them. I had to think about it for a second. I wanted to play the number 1 songs of the year because that's going to be important. It's kind of the sounds of the time. It's going to immerse you in the year. It's going to help explain what music video games use. But YouTube basically said no to that entirely. They say I can play 10 seconds of a clip. My experience is that I get 5. And anything more than 5, and YouTube flags it and will give my money to someone else or block it entirely. Those are my options. And even 5 seconds is not enough time for a lot of songs. You can't even get out the name of the song in 5 seconds sometimes. You can't sing it in time. So it just seemed pointless for me to continue trying that. So we'd have a different system where I just kind of link to playlists of #1 songs on YouTube and the top 100 songs on Spotify is what I have been doing for a while. So that's been going on for a while. This year, though, a couple films got me. The first one is Conan the Barbarian. That one, I don't remember having too hard of a time when I initially uploaded it, but months later, the distributor in Germany and Austria found my video. I don't think YouTube sent it to them and flagged it for them. I think they came and found my video and then said, this is our copyright. The film itself, the 1982 film starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, got flagged. And as a result, the video is now blocked in Germany and Austria. You cannot watch it if you are there, unless you get a proxy or a VPN or something like that. And unfortunately, that's kind of where it's going to have to be. I don't really have a choice in this, and the fact that it took so long for them to find my video tells me that YouTube didn't send it. They went out of their way to block my video. So unfortunately, there's nothing I can really do about that. It's just kind of how YouTube's system works at this point. I disagree with it. Obviously, I think that I have transformed the clips into something different, and I feel that watching my video is not a replacement for watching the film, which is therefore fair use. And it's not just me watching the film, and it's not just me showing you guys the film. I feel that I have transformed it into a much more educational piece than the original film actually was. And YouTube basically pleads the fifth. It doesn't want to talk about it. It just sends it to the copyright owner most of the time and asks them, what do you want to do with it? We noticed that these people are using clips from your copyrighted material, and it's completely up to the copyright owner what to do with it. And I know that personally because YouTube says that I'm the copyright owner for a couple video games. Very strange, but I don't have an option to tell them no. That's a whole different topic. We can get on that at a different time. The other video that got flagged was The Hobbit. When I was talking about the story of The Hobbit, not the video game, but the actual story of the novel, The Hobbit. I was able to work around that one eventually. Warner Brothers claimed it a few times, I believe 5 times total. And I found a workaround, which was to use static artwork instead of clips from the film in certain spots. I was already using artwork because the Hobbit film from 1977 doesn't include some characters. There's actual parts of the novel that they had to cut out in order to reduce the length of the film for TV. Probably it was for TV, but maybe they just didn't want to talk about Bjorn or the Eagles, or there's a whole bunch of stuff that they didn't want to talk about in the film. So I already had to use artwork for some of it. Whenever that happens, I do my best to show artwork that can be purchased. I feel that is a more ethical route to go. So I used Alan Lee's stuff. I used John Howe's stuff. That way you can go out and purchase the artwork should you want. They are professional artists who sold books based on Tolkien's work. So it feels okay for me to use that and go, hey, if you want to buy it, it is available. As opposed to me going to DeviantArt, where I'm just basically ripping off a fan-made piece of artwork. That doesn't feel as right to me. But I was able to get around The Hobbit, so that is available for everybody. Unfortunately, if you live in Germany and Austria, I'm sure you are aware that Germany and Austria has some of the most stringent copyright laws when it comes to YouTube. So you're going to have to find a workaround if you want to watch the Conan the Barbarian video. Unfortunately, there's not much I can do about that, and I do apologize. All right, so moving on to streaming. I'm on my streaming setup right now. Streaming has been pretty good this year for 1982. I would like to do more, but unfortunately, there's just some times that I just don't have the energy at the end of the week. I try to do it on Fridays in the afternoon. If you miss it, I am on Twitch. You can watch it there. I believe they give 1 or 2 weeks for my videos before they delete them. If it's actually relevant to video games over time, I will upload it onto YouTube. And there's been a few of those. So I did a couple Sogo Band videos. I did a couple videos with some other lesser games like Haunted House, Empire Strikes Back. I wanted to do a couple more games from 1982. I wanted to do, what were the three? There were three left. There was Super Pac-Man, there was Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Microsoft Flight Simulator. I wanted to do those games. Unfortunately, due to stress and stuff like that, I wasn't able to get to them. There are a lot of games and films this year that we might be able to do. For the films, I don't do what a lot of people these days are doing, which is just flat out showing things on screen. No, that's not how it works. So I go much more the way that some of my Let's Play inspirations do. That'd be the Mystery Science Theater 3000 guys. What I do is similar to what they do for riff tracks, which is I won't have the video of the film on screen. I won't have the audio of the film on screen. What I end up doing is I tell you when to hit the button to start the film, and then I comment while I'm also watching the film. I feel that's the best way to go. Those are my least popular videos by a long shot, but I do enjoy it, and I will try to keep those going for, a select number of videos. A select number of films and streams and stuff like that. I think there's just one in 1983 that I'm going to try to do. There might be a second one, but to be honest, I saw the film and I didn't like it, so probably just the one. I did want to also do the Dark Crystal, but after editing it, my video for the Dark Crystal, I decided, oh no, this is a very slow film. It suffers from pacing issues the whole time, and there's only so much I can do for pacing issues to make it entertaining, so I ended up avoiding that one anyway. The last thing that I kind of want to talk about behind the scenes, there's going to be a couple things here. One of them I really don't know how I'm going to talk about, but the first one is pronunciation. It came up a few times. I believe I had like 5 comments on my pronunciation of the letter Z. So I wanted to clarify a bit. It came up with the British computer lines, the ZX80, ZX81, and ZX Spectrum. And that's how I pronounce them. And I pronounce them that way because I'm an American. The name of the computer, the computer line, is the letter Z followed by the letters X. But they are British computers. And in England, they don't usually pronounce the letter Z as the letter Z. They pronounce it Z. So, you do the alphabet, they'll go X, Y, and Z. And that's how they end it. Canadians do it the same way, but both of them have kind of a little bit of Z in the culture. But here in America, we don't have Z at all. Nobody says Z. Everybody says Z. In fact, if you talk to a lot of Americans, I'm sure some of them will never have heard of Z. But here in America, we always say Z. So when I say the computer lines, I'm going to say ZX80, ZX81, and ZX Spectrum. If you were to go to England, they would not pronounce it that way. They would call it the ZX80, the ZX81, and the ZX Spectrum. I'm going to continue saying Z because I'm American and I speak in an American accent. That kind of goes across the board. I'm going to be pronouncing everything in an American accent. I don't like doing accents, and I don't like changing pronunciations and basically like code switching for a single word or a single phrase. I don't like doing that, and I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to stick with my American accent across the board. So it's always going to be ZX for me. But if you were to go to England, of course, they would not pronounce it that way. With that said, it's actually not the first time that I mispronounced the letter Z. It's just the first time that people got kind of upset about it. One person was not upset. Let me clarify. That person was not upset. It was a lot of other people that were like very upset. How dare I pronounce it Z instead of Z? But if you remember the first video that I made, the history of modern computing, there was a German computer scientist, and he made computers that just had his last initial on it, which was Z. And the computer that we talked about in particular was the Z4. But, of course, they didn't pronounce it Z4 if you were in Germany, but they would have said Zet, and then I looked up Zet, but I don't know how to say 4 in German. I don't speak German at all. But that's how they would have pronounced it. So it's something that has been going on since the beginning. I am going to continue speaking in an American accent, and I apologize if my pronunciation is not the one that you are used to, or the one that is most accurate in the country of origin or the region of origin or anything like that. It's not even really a translation for the British stuff. It's just a transliteration type or a regional thing. Either way, though, American accent, primarily California accent is where I grew up. So that's what I'm going to do. I did get a few more comments, people asking when this series was going to stop. I'm not sure why this came up this year. I think people just kind of got a little bored with some of the topics I was talking about in 1982, because these are a lot of lesser known games, but they're still kind of important. The answer is, like, this is it. This is what I'm doing. There's not going back to the old format. This is what we are doing. It will appear much more like the old format as we continue, but we have to get to some longer games for that to happen. That's probably not going to happen until like 1987 or so. So we're going to have a lot of shorter games leading up to that. The longer games will come in time, and then it'll appear much more like the way that it used to. But if you're expecting me to stop at some point and, say, okay, now we're through, 1985, I'm done, and we're going to go back to the way that it used to be, that's not going to happen. This is what the channel is now. Anyway, now we're going to talk about the topic that I want to talk about the least, and I'm not sure how to approach it. I guess we'll just start with the game. The game is Eastern Front. The game is, for those of you that didn't see it, it's a war simulation game. I would say it's fairly similar to chess. It's a much more expanded version, but at the end of the day, it comes across a bit like a board game. It's a war simulation game, and your characters are represented by these little squares, and you're up against these other squares that are a different color. I think they were red and black. It's been a while since I played the game. But the issue with that, and you're on like a map of like Eastern Europe and Western Russia. The problem is that in the game you play as the Nazis in World War II fighting against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, a real-life war. And anytime that we're going to talk about real-life issues, there's going to be some controversy. We're going to see that a lot as we start getting into like sports games or games that are based on real-life people. But the first issue with that is historical games. And I said it during my review of the game that I felt a little uncomfortable. We'll go with that term. It was a little unnerving for me to play as Nazis and to play like a real life war effort, playing as the Nazis, where I am basically trying to outperform the Nazis in real life. Like how they did in World War II, I'm trying to best that. It was a little weird. And I probably should have emphasized that more. I'm not like, that's, it was weird. I didn't enjoy it. If you haven't played it yourself, I honestly can't, I don't think I recommended it all that much, but it was important to the history of video games. So I did want to, show this kind of prototype of war games, and it was important. It was influential, and it was well reviewed at the time. So I played it. As time has gone on, though, there's been a few people that show up to that video. A couple people are war enthusiasts, which is fine. A couple people are war game enthusiasts, which is also fine. A couple people are World War II enthusiasts, which is mostly okay. But there's a subset of World War II enthusiasts that appear to like the war for the wrong reasons. And a couple of them have shown up. on those videos. And it was not in my intention to attract that kind of audience. I tried my best to kind of disassociate with them, and anytime they show up, I delete their comments, but they are showing up. And the problem is that they also wanted the Nazis to do better in World War II than they actually did. And the game comes across as wish fulfillment for them. And I felt the need to address it at least a little bit, try to distance myself from there. I don't like Nazis. I felt like I shouldn't have to say that. I am not a fan. I feel like it goes without saying. But that video has attracted people who feel differently than that. And I will continue to delete their comments as they come across. But just know that that has reached a subset of the population that is controversial, to say the least. Abhorrent would be a better word for it. It definitely goes counter to how I feel. And so I want to distance myself as much as I can from them. I played the game because of its importance, its place in video game history, and nothing else. And if you watch the video, you'll probably get that, but there are other people that are showing up, and that is unnerving to me. With that said, I'm going to leave the video up because of its importance, but just know that there are people who feel differently that are sometimes watching that video. There's not many, don't get me wrong, but there's enough for me to have to say something. And that's unfortunate. It really is. Once again, though, there were a couple people that were just World War II enthusiasts, and they tried to make an argument as to why this particular battle was chosen, why the Eastern Front was chosen for this game. And it was that basically their argument is that World War II is the most important war in all of history, which I disagree with. I don't think there is one, but it's probably not World War II. But they're saying it's the most important war in all of history, not just like 20th century, all of history. And number two, what happened to the Nazis is really the most important thing to happen in World War II, which I would also disagree with. But that was the argument that they made for why the game was made that way. And it's, I don't know, it's an issue. And I feel like I've addressed it, but yeah, don't like that. Don't like that at all. All right, so let's talk about things I learned in 1982. Let's move on from that. The first thing that I learned is how hard it is to condense Tolkien. Oh man, Tolkien, he tells long stories, and it is really hard for me to condense it. I had to do a separate video just for The Hobbit. I'm not going to lie, we're going to have to do videos on Lord of the Rings at some point. And I'm just not sure when that's going to happen. I think there's one coming up this year in 1983, but I haven't mapped out everything in 1983 yet. But Tolkien is verbose, and it's hard to condense his stories down to this kind of format. I think that I did a fairly good job, but there was so much more I wanted to talk about, as we'll get into later. I'm a huge fan of Tolkien. I've read the Silmarillion several times. It's actually one of my favorite books. It's hard to tell people that because they get in and they're like, I don't understand what's going on, and it's not written well. And I'm like, no, you have to keep going. And it starts adding up. But yeah, it's one of my favorites. So we'll talk about that at some other point. But it was really difficult for me to condense Tolkien and the Hobbit videos down to a format that I felt was short enough for people to still be interested while still keeping people entertained. It was very difficult. I'm not sure how to feel about those videos because there was still so much more I wanted to talk about than I had the chance to. So I'm just not sure if I'm proud of them or whatever, but there was so much. Next on my list is 1982. So as a whole, and we'll talk about this at the end of my personal experience with the topics, which is next. Overall, I would say 1982 is a down year, which is, it's a weird thing for me to say considering we have more videos in this year than any other year. And I think that like over a third of the videos in the playlist are now 1982. It's so big compared to the other years. Yet I would still say overall, most of the things were kind of worse. They were important. They were worth talking about, but I don't know. It didn't feel like a big upward trend for me in 1982. And some of that has to do with the games that I played and the stories that I had to talk about. But there were some highlights, but I would say that there were more highlights in other years, if that makes sense. There were a lot of sequels in 1982. Most of them, I would say, were worse than the originals. The exception being Ms. Pac-Man. That comes to mind immediately. But of the video games that we played, like a lot of the sequels were just not as good or just kind of blatant copies of the original. The licensed titles that we did, there were a lot of licensed titles this year. Most of them were very disappointing. It was hard to see a licensed title, a game that was inspired by a film that was something that was like groundbreaking or great or anything. Most of them were just seemingly cash grabs, ways to get people to buy the game without it being a quality game. That's what it came across a lot of the time as. So I will say that 1982, without spoiling too much, is seen as a peak for a lot of people. And for me, I would say 1981 was a better year than 1982. So I kind of disagree with that, just kind of getting into my experience. But a lot of people are going to disagree, and they say 1982, best year before, for a while. We won't get too much into that, but it's the peak, so it's good before, good after, yeah, that kind of thing. All right, so let's get into the personal experiences with the topics. There's a lot of topics. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but that's my dog. She's struggling. Emotionally, mentally, it's been taxing on all of us, what's been going on here. Anyway, the first one that we did in 1982 was Zaxxon. Zaxxon, I was surprised. It was a pretty good game. I hadn't even, I don't think I played it. I'm not sure if I even heard of it before I started doing research for this. I definitely had never seen it in an arcade or anything like that, but Zaxxon proved to be a pretty good game. So yeah, no experience with that one, but I was happy to see something innovative, and it kind of set my expectations a little high for this year. Next one we did was Ms. Pac-Man. I have, of course, played Ms. Pac-Man before. I'm not sure where I first played it. I don't necessarily have any fond memories of it, but I remember playing it. I remember liking it more than Pac-Man, and I still feel that way. I still feel that Ms. Pac-Man is a better version of Pac-Man than the original. There has been a part of me that has wondered if part of that is because Ms. Pac-Man is just a hair faster than the original Pac-Man, but I haven't been able to conclusively find any evidence on whether Ms. Pac-Man is faster than Pac-Man. Even when I put them side by side, I'm like, I think so, I'm not sure. And then there's like different versions of Ms. Pac-Man, so there might be a version that I played growing up that was faster that I enjoyed more. Next up is Conan the Barbarian. To be honest, I wasn't a huge fan of Conan. It's not my kind of story. I'm a much bigger Tolkien guy. So Conan the Barbarian, I did see growing up. I have appreciated it. I have read so many Conan the Barbarian comics. I haven't read the original stories, actually. No, I haven't read the original stories, but I've seen the film. When I was younger, I watched the film. I was probably a teenager when I finally got to it, because it's not for children. But yeah, it just never really got into it. It was just not for me. It was, I don't know. I just didn't associate myself with the ultra masculine character. You know what I mean? And so it didn't really work for me. Sorry about that. Next up, we do have Dig Dug. Dig Dug, I don't have much experience of. I remember vaguely when I was a kid that I thought the game was slow. I don't remember where I played it. It might have been on a computer. I had a lot of old arcade games on a computer, but Yeah, Dig Dug I don't remember all that well. I just remember somewhere thinking that it was slow. And that's all I can really remember about it, which isn't much to say, I know. Next up, we have Deadline. Deadline, I hadn't heard of at all until I started doing the research. I never really went in that far into Infocom's game library. I knew about Zork, but I had never heard of Deadline. Like I said, I didn't do that much research into Infocom themselves. But as I was doing research for this, Infocom kept on coming up, and Deadline showed up as one of their better games. So made the list, and I'm so happy that it did. Turned out to be really good. A lot of the games that I hadn't heard of until I did research, they're because they're on computers, and we've talked about this before. Especially the more mature games, the games for, not children, in the early 80s on computers in particular, they don't necessarily have the nostalgia factor of a lot of other games, so you don't hear a lot of people talking about them. But Deadline turned out to be a highlight of 1982. So I'm so happy to see it make my list and be able to find it and play it. I wouldn't necessarily call it a hidden gem, but it's definitely not a game that is talked about as often as it probably should be. Next up, we have ZX Spectrum. I'm still going to say it that way. I have no experience with ZX Spectrums. I did have computers growing up, but because I was born in 1986, they were far more advanced than the ZX Spectrum. Spoilers, computers keep getting better. So by the time I got a computer, ZX Spectrum was long gone off the market. And we'll talk about my experience with computers at some other point. But, all the computers that we're going to talk about here, never had. Next up is Yar's Revenge. Yar's Revenge, I believe that I had downloaded at some point to try to play. And I just didn't understand what was going on, and at the time, because it was an Atari game, I wasn't willing to do a lot of research to try to figure out how to play the game. It's not intuitive, like most Howard Scott Warshaw games. It's kind of complicated, and you need instructions just to figure out how to start. And it's now, in my mind, more associated with E.T. than anything else, than, it standing by itself. It's still amazing to me that someone at some point said that that was the best game of all time. I really do not see it. But yeah, my personal experience, not much. I had downloaded it, and because I didn't give a lot of respect to the Atari when I was going through these kinds of games at that point, which was years and years ago, I didn't give it the time of day that I probably should. It's a good game, don't get me wrong, but best game of all time? Nah. Next up, we have Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. Growing up, my dad was a Star Trek fan. So I was exposed to Star Trek early. To be honest, though, I didn't enjoy it growing up. When I was, like single digits, like 6 to 9, like it was, I wasn't a fan of Star Trek at the time. It was boring. Like, it's not for children, it's for adults. But I went back to Star Trek in my teenage years, Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, or is it The Wrath of Khan? Either way, it's one of the highlights for me. I really do enjoy the film. It's one of my favorite entries in sci-fi, just kind of as a whole. But definitely the Star Trek universe. One of the best Star Trek films. Or one of the best pieces of Star Trek media, I should say. So I did have experience with that growing up. But really as a teenager is when I got into Star Trek and started appreciating that one. E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now we're talking about the film itself. I don't know. It just never really got to me. I had, of course, heard of E.T., seen E.T. in media and stuff like that, but in terms of the actual film itself, it somehow missed me. Which is why I was so surprised to hear not only how popular it was, but how the merchandise got around. I don't think I've seen E.T. merchandise really anywhere. And a lot of that might have to do with the game. Like, the game might have killed the film. Like, that's how bad the video game was received. But it's still a good film. I've seen it a few times. We did a watch party for it. It's good. I like it. But yeah, somehow I missed it growing up. Moon Patrol. Once again, something that missed me growing up, and I think that has a lot to do with it being on the computers. a lot of games that were on computers I didn't hear about until much later in life. I'm not sure I had heard of Moon Patrol until I had done the research for this. Maybe I had heard of it, but I definitely had never played it, never really seen it. Interesting game. Interesting. Next up, we have Jungle Hunt. Jungle Hunt, I had missed Jungle Hunt / Jungle King, I should say. Didn't see a lot of it. I think I had seen that a version of it became very popular, and therefore I had heard of it. But once again, it was at a time when I wasn't giving games this old the time of day. It was probably my late teens, early 20s when that was going on. Next up, we have Choplifter. Choplifter is an interesting game. I had heard of it, definitely, but I had never played it, especially this original version of the game. And this is a rare one, and we'll talk about why it's kind of weird later. But the original version of the game on the computers, once again, it's a computer game, so not a lot of people are going to have heard of it. Not a lot of people are going to have nostalgia for it. And that's unfortunate because it's a good game. Blade Runner. The film itself, Blade Runner. This is a film that I had heard legendary stories of forever. I had been told forever it's based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And, to a 12-year-old, that means nothing. But I had heard about it. I didn't actually get a chance to watch it until I was in my 20s, to be honest. And when I did watch it, I went, oh, wow, this is really good. Watching it a couple more times and now associating it with video games as I did, as I'm doing now, it's so apparent how influential it was on some of my favorite games. And without Blade Runner, I'm not sure the games that were made would be my favorite games. So definitely became more impactful the older that I get, the more that I look at it. But because it's, once again, kind of an adult film, it's for people over, probably about 20, 25. It's not something that hit me as a kid. But when I finally did get a chance to see it, I thought it was very good. Next up, we have the Atari 5200. I definitely did not have an Atari 5200 as a kid. I might have had an Atari 2600, but I was so young when, I had just have a vague memory of basically a wooden box. So we might have had an Atari 2600 because I vaguely remember playing some sort of game. For whatever reason, in my mind, it was Fish. But literally, that's all that I have in terms of memories of what could possibly be an Atari 2600. A 5200, we definitely did not have. Definitely nothing comes to mind when I think of that. And it's often a forgotten console, but we'll keep an eye on it. Maybe there'll be a couple games for it that we play. Maybe. Next up, Robotron 2084. Now, I had never actually played the original Robotron 2084 until I started doing these videos. I had played several games based on it, right? It became a popular format. If you watched my Let's Play of Stardew Valley, they have a version of Robotron 2084 as a minigame in there. So I, of course, have played versions based on it, but I never played the original. It's frantic, man. It is difficult. But definitely a good game and highly influential. Next up, we have Dragon Stomper. Dragon Stomper is a very strange game, and not a lot of people are going to have memories of it, myself included. I had never heard of Dragon Stomper until I had done the videos for this. But once again, happy I did, because it surpassed the Atari 2600 limitations. Because they had the supercharger, they made the Atari 2600 more powerful, and they were able to make a better game for it. But yeah, never had heard of it. It's supposed to be the first console RPG, which is why I made sure to play it. And I'm glad I did. There's not a lot of RPGs back in 1982, so any RPG that we can get, which is my favorite genre, I am happy to do. And obviously, as I play, RPGs are going to be showing up as my favorite, so we're probably going to play more of those than we do other genres. Or at least we're going to go deeper into the RPG genre than we are other genres. But I think it's worth it, because I think especially at the time, those are the best games. Those are the ones that I'm going to remember the most. Next up is Demon Attack. I had seen the cartridges for Demon Attack everywhere. They're very popular, but never played it myself. Got a chance to play it here. I can see why it's influential. I can see why it was popular, but just kind of like about my talk about RPGs. Shooters are not my favorite. It's not my favorite genre, especially these kinds of like space shooters. They don't necessarily stand out as much to me. I was surprised to see how much of an improvement one of the ports of Demon Attack was. I believe it was for the Intellivision. It's just like, oh, geez, that's so much better. But the original and most popular version is the 2600 version. So that's the one we did. And it's a good game, but once again, never had played it, seen it forever because it's a very popular game, but never got around to playing it myself. Miner 2049er. Hadn't heard of it until I started researching this. Once again, it's a computer game, so that's not too surprising. But I'm glad we got to it. It's an interesting take on what would become the platform genre. I believe that name officially happens in 1983. Somebody finally comes up with the name platform game. I think at the time it's still known as a climbing game, which isn't very accurate for Miner 2049er, if we're being honest. He doesn't actually climb. He just jumps from platform to platform. But yeah, hadn't heard of it. It's definitely a better game of the year, I would say. But also a game that is going to be overshadowed by other games in the genre later. Even next year, we might forget about Miner 2049, but it's important for 1982. Next up, we have the Tron film. Tron is a film that I did see relatively young, and I think it was like the mid-90s. So at the time, I thought it did not look good. I would say that Tron's graphics did not age well, and pretty much the whole thing is graphics. They didn't age well, but it's so influential on one of my favorite TV shows, and I think that's why I thought it was not very good, is because I was watching a TV show that was inspired by Tron, and I think did things a lot better than Tron. And we'll talk about that, but that's in the 90s, right? It had a whole, had a whole decade to try to improve upon the Tron formula. So going back to Tron was not that great for me personally, but I can see why people have a lot of nostalgia for it. But there are a lot of people out there that if you say Tron doesn't look good now, which I don't think it does, they get upset. But it looked good for the time, and I will give it that. But by today's standards, man, it's a little hard to watch at points, and a lot of people feel that way looking at it now, having not grown up with it. Next up, we have Pole Position. Pole Position, I had never gotten a chance to play. Like, it wasn't anywhere in any of the in the arcades that I had growing up. Even now, I go to a retro arcade from time to time now. They don't have Pole Position. It's a harder cabinet to get, and it takes up a lot of room. But I'm glad that I finally got a chance to play it, which I got the chance for the channel for this project, obviously. And I'm glad that I did. It's definitely one of the better racing games, especially for the time. So I'm happy we got to it. Next up, we have Joust. Now, Joust I have actually played a few times. I think this was one of the ones that I had on the computer growing up. But I was never a huge fan of it. It's weird. You're flying ostriches. You don't really attack. You just kind of bump into people. It's hard to control. It's a weird game. And I gave it the time of day as a kid like twice. Like, it was just, okay, I'm going to move on to better games than that I had. But, it's a classic at the end of the day. And it's amazing to me still that it is. And it has everything to do with the gameplay and the fact that it's just so strange. Anyway, the Tron Arcade game. The Tron Arcade game, I had never played before, but I had heard of it. But I had never seen anything of it. which is so surprising to me. It is just a collection of minigames, and none of them are particularly good, granted, but for how influential the movie was and for them to make an arcade game of it, I'm surprised more people don't talk about it. But yeah, I have no memories of the Tron Arcade game. Next up, Colecovision. Colecovision I have no experience with. I just didn't have it growing up. I don't know anybody that did have it. So I never got a chance to do anything with it. And once again, it's before my time. We'll talk about why consoles in particular are before my time later. But yeah, just nothing to do with Colecovision. Next up, Donkey Kong Jr. A little bit of a story for this one. I did play Donkey Kong originally on my channel before this project, and then kind of returned to it. My original plan was to go to Donkey Kong Jr. and kind of follow that a bit, but I almost spoiled things there. But I booted up Donkey Kong Jr. and tried to play it, and I was so bad at it that I decided to scrap the whole idea and not do any videos on Donkey Kong Jr. So I had been practicing since then because I knew that I was so bad at Donkey Kong Jr. that I wasn't going to be able to show off other levels. I was so bad at it. So after having played other platform games, climbing games at the time, made me better so that when I did get to Donkey Kong Jr., it only took me about 20-30 minutes of practice before I started figuring out what was going on, and I could play the game well. But I had originally thought that I was going to play it a long time ago when I was kind of going through when I went through Donkey Kong, and then was going to try to do things in chronological order a bit then by like game franchise, so to speak. But I stopped at Donkey Kong Jr. because I was so bad at it. But before then, I had never played it before, never seen it. So I got a lot better pretty quickly, thankfully. Next up, we have Commodore 64. Once again, computer of the time, not something that I had because my first computer had to be the first one that I actually sat down on and played had to be from the early 90s. So I didn't have anything like it. A lot of people really did. A lot of people really loved the Commodore 64. A lot of people were upset that I didn't talk more about the Commodore 64, but it's because the Commodore 64, spoilers, has such a long lifespan that I can't talk about stuff from 1984 in 1982. I can't talk about stuff from 1986 and 1982. We will continue to talk about the Commodore 64, and people that might have been a little upset that I didn't talk more about it will probably be happier with my retrospective on the Commodore 64 when it does eventually go out of commission. Because as you might expect, all computers are going to go out of commission at some point. So are consoles, eventually. Next up, we have Advanced Dungeons & Dragons for the Intellivision. This was a weird game. Honestly, it originally made my list because there was, like I said, the first console RPG was Dragon Stomper. Some people were saying that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was the first console RPG, so I figured it was worth a shot to look at. After all, it's got the name. It's got AD&D on the box. It should be exactly what we're looking for in a Dungeons and Dragons games. It should basically be Wizardry, you know what I mean? But turned out not to be Wizardry. Where is Wizardry on my list? Did I forget Wizardry? Oh, I skipped right over Wizardry. Shit. We'll go back and talk about Wizardry because I accidentally skipped it. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I hadn't played. I had heard that it existed, but I knew nothing about it until I did research here. And it almost didn't make my list because I was then told, actually, it's not an RPG. It is it's more of an adventure or an action game, which it totally is. It's not an RPG at all. But I'm still glad that I played it because it's a topic worth talking about, if nothing else. Next up, we have Wizardry 2, which was actually older than this, but we're going to talk about it now because I accidentally skipped it. Wizardry 2, I had heard of Wizardry, of course. We played the original. I had never seen or played Wizardry 2 for myself, just like I had never played Wizardry 1 until I started doing this. But honestly, I had to say it was one of the bigger disappointments for me because it just kind of came across as an expansion. The fact that I have to bring my characters forward and all that. I would say it's a worse game than Wizardry 1. That's kind of my personal take on it. And mostly it's because it has no innovation. It is literally just take your characters from Wizardry 1 and do 5 more levels with them. You know, that's basically what the game is. There's not, I think it's 6 levels. But anyway, it's you know, it's an expansion. It's not a new game. It's just we have a slightly more adventure for you here. So that's Wizardry 2. Next up, Zork 3. I did do Zork 3 on my channel before. I went through all 3 Zork games on my channel before I started doing this. So I knew what I was getting into. Once again, a little bit of a letdown for me. Doesn't have the big finale that I was hoping for Zork. I still think the first Zork is my favorite of the 3. And kind of like Wizardry 2, it's just kind of a continuation of what you were doing before. At least with Zork 3, it's kind of a new character, and it's because you haven't been building a character in an RPG, it doesn't kind of come across the same. So there's something to be said about that. Pitfall is up next. Pitfall, I had actually played a couple times before. It's an interesting game. It ended up making to me on computers at some point in the early 2000s, I believe it was. I had a subscription service at the time, and Pitfall was free as long as I was subscribed. So I ended up playing that one quite a bit. It's one of the first games that I played where cheating got me nowhere. Like, I cheated because there was a time limit on the game at the time, I think. At least the version that I had a time limit of some sort. So I was using what's known as save states, where, you know, basically you use your computer to save the actual console's state entirely. We've kind of talked about it a little bit before, but I was doing it for Pitfall, and I just kept on going to the right, and I couldn't figure out why, what was going on. I'm missing so much stuff. And yeah, I save stated to my heart's content, did things as quickly as I possibly could, and still lost because I didn't know what I was doing. Right? You have to use the underground tunnels if you want to get the time limit to not be the biggest hindrance to you. So yeah, one of those games that, because it was an Atari game, I didn't give as much of a chance as I should have. But coming back to it now, it's still very good. Plus, we got to see a very young Jack Black. I don't know if you guys recognized him, but I sure as hell did. Next up, we have Ultima 2. Ultima 2, I haven't played any of the Ultima games until we started doing this. Ultima 2, I will say, though, once I started doing even the slightest bit of research into it, a YouTube video came up saying Ultima 2 basically is the worst RPG that I have ever played. And I think that's a little harsh, but I understand where he's coming from. I was very disappointed in Ultima 2. To me, it just felt like they took everything that was good about Ultima 1 and made it go away because they didn't understand what was good about it. And you end up with a lot of small problems that add up to one big problem and make the game not that fun. So Ultima 2, probably the biggest disappointment for me, but that's because I had high expectations going into it. But we'll talk more about that when I get to my rewards. Next up, we have Burger Time. Burger Time I had never played before. I have seen it in arcades, actually. There was an arcade, the Retro Arcade, last time we went, which I think was Halloween, right before I recorded Burger Time. I was like, oh, maybe I should get some practice in, and then I decided against it. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. It's a game that is fun for me because it's burgers, and I've always been interested in food. I went to culinary school, if you didn't know, but yeah, that didn't work out. But Burger Time, it's a fun game, but yeah, missed me. I didn't get a chance to see it. Mr. Do, I'm gonna say Mr. Do. I've heard a couple people say Mr. Doe, but I believe it's supposed to be Mr. Do. That game is one that I had heard of, only vaguely. I had never really seen before, but I'm glad that I did, because I would say it was an improvement over Dig Dug because of the speed, because of what you're doing, even though it's very strange, all that kind of stuff. But definitely worthwhile to get into that. Next up, we have the Pacman TV Show. Now, I saw that, actually, before I started doing these videos. I did watch the Pacman TV Show at some point. I believe it was only a couple years ago. But even if it was still only a couple years ago, it was so bland that I don't remember anything about it. It's one of my shortest videos during this project, because it is just a Saturday morning cartoon show. Let's be honest. It's a Saturday morning cartoon show that they squeezed Pac-Man into. And they're like, I don't know, bring him dots and bring in the ghosts, and we already had this villain. Let's just make it like the ghost's uncle or something. It's just such an early 80s, late 70s Saturday morning cartoon show that it's so unmemorable that the only reason that I ended up talking about it was because it was Pac-Man, and it's the first video game TV show. I'm not going to be talking about all the TV shows as we continue forward. There's a lot of TV shows that end up using video games, but Pac-Man's the first, so we had to talk about it. That's basically it. But in terms of the show itself, you could put it up against pretty much anything else by Hanna-Barbera, and you would be able to tell what's going to happen in the whole show. It's not particularly good. It's so bland. Next up, we have Cubert. Cubert, I actually did play growing up, or at least a version of Cubert. I played a Cubert game. I don't remember which one it was. My uncle actually had it. It was one of his favorite games. So he had it, I believe, on a console that we're going to talk about soon. I'm pretty sure it was a console game. But he was a huge fan of Cubert, so I got into it because of him. It's one of those games that it just takes a bit for you to get used to what your directions do, because I'm used to it on a D-pad. We've talked about a D-pad, so hooray, we can talk about D-pads now. I played it on a D-pad, and down actually meant like down and to the right, so you kind of had to get used to that. But once you got used to that, the game's fun. But I did have an experience with Cubert at some point growing up, so I was fond of the game. J.R.R. Tolkien. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about Tolkien and my personal experience with it. Let's just go with this. I had heard of it for a long time growing up. Sorry. I'd grown up hearing about it. I ended up purchasing it in school. I bought The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in a pack, which I still have. I bought that in 5th grade. I know specifically it was in 5th grade because that was the only year I was at that school. So I bought it in 5th grade. And then it was at the Scholastic School Fair, you know, when they would give you like a list of books in the catalog and you would mark it off. That's when I bought it. But then I didn't read it for a long time. I ended up reading it for the first time in junior high. I was in 8th grade. Because you had to get a certain amount of points. You had to get like 12 points a semester by reading books and taking a test. And the Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit each were worth 4 points. So I was all over them. I'm like, wait, I have these. These are good. So I read them. But I read them so quick to try to get the points that I didn't remember much about it. Like, people would ask me who Airmare was, and I'd be like, I don't know. And they're like, who was the guy who was hanging out with Theoden and stuff? I just stare at him blankly. He's from Rohan. Oh, he's the horse guy from Rohan. Like I said, I blasted through those books just so I could take the test and get the points. So I didn't remember much. And then once I graduated high school, during high school. It was still during high school. I got into a gaming group. We'll just call it that for now. We'll talk about which game it was later. It was a video game group. And they were their group names were all inspired by Tolkien. So I got back into it then and reread them all. And this time actually absorbed everything and became a huge fan of it ever since. And I've never looked back, been addicted to Tolkien ever since. For the record, my name in the group was Gandalf. And I earned it, damn it. I wasn't old, but damn it, I knew everything. So got into it then, never looked back. And that kind of gives me the lead into The Hobbit. I had seen The Hobbit film actually in elementary school, but once again, I was in like third grade, so it was slow, like way too slow for me. Like you have to be like 10 or 12 to like the Hobbit film. Like once I was like 7 or 8, like it just didn't work for me. It was so slow, and they kept singing. I hated singing in films at the time, so I didn't like it. But like I said, I know the books very well. I know the stories very well. I know the history behind the stories very well. And I want to give more information to you. And I have my own personal theories. Like, Tolkien is Sam. Sam is the self-insertion. They're like, no, it's this other character. I'm like, no, it's definitely Sam. And C.S. Lewis is Frodo. But that's my own personal theory, and we can talk about that some other time. All right, next up, the Hobbit video game. The Hobbit video game is something that I never saw and never played, and I was really looking forward to it. And it turned out to be pretty good, but yeah, there were a lot of disappointments for me personally when I played it, not only because everything had to be cut so short in order to squeeze it onto the computer, but because there were some glitches that we got while playing. Things didn't work out the way I wanted, but if you saw it, people kind of commented on it. You can see in the comments, like, that doesn't normally happen. Like, well, it happened for me. What do you want me to tell you? I have sometimes just some bad luck in video games. And I'm not going to lie, specifically with Tolkien video games, I might play worse ones than, I might have a lower criteria for what makes my list, because I am desperate to find the best Tolkien game out there. I want to play them. I'm a huge fan of Tolkien. And maybe I'll try to keep them to streams and stuff, but I'm on the hunt. I want to play Tolkien games. Next up, we have Millipede. I don't know if I've played Millipede, to be honest. I don't think I have. I think I only played Centipede growing up, and I don't think I ever got Millipede, because I don't remember there being arrows. I don't remember all the other enemies showing up. So I don't think I had played Millipede growing up. I think I only played Centipede. But I'm glad that we did. I would honestly say that Millipede is another one of those exceptions where the sequel is better than the original, but not by a lot. Although it's faster and there are more enemies, it's a little bit more frantic. It depends on your personal gaming style, you know. Next up, we have Xevious. Xevious, I had heard of vaguely because it's kind of a legendary arcade game, but I had never actually seen it, and I had never actually played it. So getting to play it this time, I was happy to do that. I'm trying to go quick, but like I said, there's a lot to talk about. The E.T. video game. The E.T. video game. I'm sure if you're here, you have heard of the E.T. video game. It's legendary, and I have seen a couple people show clips of the game before this, but I've never actually seen a full explanation of the game. And so it was always difficult for me because they would just show clips, right? There's a very famous film, as it turned out, from an internet personality that talked about it. But he also didn't really, he probably showed the most clips of anybody that I've seen, but, because of his format, he didn't really explain what was what the game was trying to be. So I felt the need to kind of go, well, this is what they were going for, and this is how they failed. So I was happy to kind of shed light and kind of give a more balanced approach to the game, not just going in saying it's the worst video game of all time, let me show you why. Just going, this is what happened, this is what he was going for, this is how the game works, and this is why it fails. And I think that I did a decent job of that. But I had never fully played the game myself until I had done this, and I had done the research into it. But I'm glad that I did, because so many people talk about it, and so many people have so many different opinions on it, and it felt wrong for me not to try to give my own opinion on it. I almost didn't talk about it because it's known as a bad game. I almost just left it for honorable mentions, but I felt that it was one of the most important video games in history, so I had to talk about it, even if it's bad. We won't be doing that a lot. Next up, we have River Raid. Now, River Raid, I had not heard too much of growing up, and it was just one of those games that I was told other games were trying to copy. So I hadn't had a chance to see too much of it. Now that I have seen it, yeah, a lot of things copy it. And like a lot of games that other games copy, the other games are usually better. As, you know, people try to copy the same game for 10 years, one of them is going to be better than the original. And that definitely happened to River Raid. Xevious to some extent too, but River Raid in particular, I wouldn't say it was... it doesn't stand the test of time simply because everything else did it too. Like there were so many others that this kind of just falls away and is usually forgotten. But it's one of the first, so it's important to talk about. The last topic, there's so many, was the Dark Crystal. The Dark Crystal film in particular. To be honest, I wanted to talk about this film because there is a specific video game that I wanted to play, and now that I've done my due diligence in trying to get that game working, I can't get that game working. So we might have talked about the Dark Crystal film and then not play the game. That angers me. But yeah, I can't get it to work. I'll keep working on it though. The Dark Crystal is a film that I had not seen too much. I did not see it growing up. I probably watched it a couple of years ago when I was going through films that I watched chronologically, and I went through 1982. It's good, but it wasn't influential on me personally. Actually, it's one of Han's favorite films. They loved it growing up, but it was something that missed me somehow. Just never got to it. All right. So that's my personal experiences with topics. There were so many of them. There won't be this many again for a while. But let's move on to things to keep in mind. All right. So in terms of full, like plug-in TV consoles, the Atari 2600 is still by far the most popular. Keep in mind, though, it was released in 1977. We are at the technical capabilities of the Atari 2600. It wasn't a powerful machine when it came out. So for it to still be this popular 5 years on, and for them to not figure out a way to make it more powerful, except for that supercharger, it feels like the Atari 2600 is a step back now when we play games for it. At least that's what it feels like to me. There are exceptions, don't get me wrong. Like Pitfall comes to mind, River Raid, where the technical capabilities of the games are seemingly better than what the Atari 2600 should be able to handle, but they somehow made it able to function. But like, I don't see a big future for the Atari 2600 at this point, because the arcade games and the computer games and even some of the other consoles are so much more powerful and technically not necessarily brilliant, but they're technically better than anything that the Atari 2600 could possibly handle. But it's still the most powerful. Keep in mind, Atari released a new console in 1982, the Atari 5200, and still the Atari 2600 is more powerful. It is more popular. But that's just the TV home consoles. If we look at consoles overall, Game & Watch is the most popular line of consoles. The fact that Donkey Kong got 8 million sales is a huge deal. Like, that's huge. The Atari 2600 in total by the end of 1982 had 15 million consoles. So for one Game & Watch to get over half of that in a single year is a huge deal. So don't underestimate the Japanese market. In 1982, the Japanese market is very big, especially when it comes to arcades and consoles. Computers, not so much. Not yet. But arcades and consoles for the Japanese market is something that you should be paying attention to. It is big. It's almost as big as the American market as a whole. That's crazy to think about. It's crazy because Japan has so many less people in it than America at the time. Anyway. Next up, things to keep in mind. We have looked at a few flops this year. The Atari 5200, ET, the Pac-Man 2600. Even though those last two games did sell well, they're flops. Don't expect us to look at flops all the time. The only reason that we talked about these is that they're so important and influential. They had a huge impact on the market as a whole. That's why we talked about them. Don't expect us to talk about every, worst video game of all time. We're not going to do that. We're mostly going to focus on the good games. But because these were so influential and they had a huge impact on the industry, we have to talk about it. So in the future, nothing comes to mind. I'm just throwing this out as a hypothetical. Should a video game company release a game that is so bad that it bankrupts the company, we're going to talk about that game because it's important and influential. But if somebody releases a bad game and it's like from somebody that we're not already following, it doesn't take down a major company, and it's largely just forgotten outside of the fact that it's a bad game, then we're not going to talk about it. Simple as that. All right. Number of ports. Number of ports is huge. And unfortunately, it's not going to go away. Like I said before, it is something that is worth talking about because it is a different experience. You saw the difference between the Pac-Man games, right? The Pac-Man port was huge for the Atari 2600, but it was also released for the Atari 5200, and I believe it was the Atari 8-bit computers. I shouldn't call them 8-bit yet. The Atari 400 and 800. They're eventually called 8-bits, but for now, the Atari 400 and 800. Those were 4 different experiences. If you played it in the arcade, it was 1. If you played it in the Atari 2600, you were mad. If you played it for the Atari 5200, you're like, oh, that's a little better. You play it for the computers, oh, okay, this is close. 4 completely different experiences, though. So we're going to continue talking about them as long as they are vastly different. At some point, ports are going to not mean much. And then we can stop talking about them as much. But for now, we have to keep talking about them. And in 1983, I'm not going to lie, there's probably more ports than there were in 1982. There's more that we're going to talk about. And one of the reasons for that is that console developers as a whole, they still look at consoles as a way to create lesser versions of successful arcade games. They look at an arcade game and say, I'm going to do exactly that, but worse. Maybe that's not their goal going in, but that's the result coming out every time. So there's still going to be ports that we talk about for a long time. But once we start getting to the point where a port between different consoles or different computers or from the arcade to a home version is not different as a general statement, then we can stop talking about ports as much. But for now, we still have to keep talking about them. Final thing. As I've said all along, just because something's popular doesn't make it good. I have said this many times before. Just because something is the best selling doesn't make it the best. The quality and the popularity are 2 completely different things. The 2 best examples of that are E.T. and Pac-Man for the Atari 2600. E.T. is one of the most popular games for the Atari 2600. I think it's, even now, at all time, it's still in the top 10 of all time. It's up there. But that doesn't make it better than, Dragon Stomper, which barely sold anything. But Dragon Stomper is a far better game than the E.T. game. But E.T. is far more popular. Then we have the Pac-Man. The Pac-Man game for the Atari 2600. By far the worst version that you can buy in 1982 is the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man. By far it's the worst, but it was by far the most popular. By a long shot. Wasn't even close. Everything else was like nothing in sales compared to the Atari 2600 version. It was the most popular. That doesn't necessarily make it good. So always keep in mind, just because popular doesn't make it good. Also, just because critics at the time liked it doesn't make it good today, but that's a whole different thing. Okay, time to get into awards. This has been a long video. We're going to keep going, though. Awards. Favorite TV show. Once again, this is one of the hardest ones for me to come up with, but my favorite TV show, I think, of 1982, and none of them are particularly good for me, but I'm going to give it to Super Dimension Fortress Macross. And I say Macross. It could be Macross, but I think it's Macross, like macro. It's an anime, Japanese show about It takes place in space, humans fighting aliens. That's pretty much all that I can say without spoiling too much, but I like it. It's not as good as some of the other series. I like Yamato better, Space Battleship Yamato better, but for 1982, this is probably it. Yeah. Honorable mentions go to Doctor Who and Urusei Yatsura, which are still going, but yeah, Doctor Who's still on the 5th Doctor, and he's not my favorite. Urusei Yatsura is still cute, but once again, not for everybody. I think I like Macross more. Favorite film? There was a lot of good films in 1982. A lot of good films. I'm going to give it to Blade Runner, though. That's probably my favorite because I love the style. It just kind of oozes this mood that nothing else quite gets. And the story is good. It's got some deep meanings to it, so I'm going to give it to Blade Runner. Honorable mentions, though, First Blood, which is something that we didn't get a chance to talk about. That stars, the main character in that goes by the name of John Rambo, but it's a completely different Rambo than the one that comes to mind when I say it to you, probably. It's a film about PTSD from war. And it's very good, and it inspires more to come. Another honorable mention, The Flight of Dragons. Now, this is something that I grew up with, so it's one of my favorite childhood films, and I don't know anybody else that's seen it, except for me. So, if anybody out there has seen The Flight of Dragons, it's a Rankin Bass animated film about a nerdy guy that somehow magically gets turned into a dragon and enters a fantasy world where there's like 4 brothers that are fighting against each other for supremacy in this fantasy world using their dragons. So it's honestly one of my favorite childhood films. I think it holds up fairly well today. It's not the best by any means, but I have lots of fond memories watching that growing up. So it'd be cool if anybody else had heard of it or watched it, but like I said, to this point, I don't know anybody that has. Next up, Sophie's Choice. It's a really good film. Hard to watch. Harder to watch multiple times, but very good film. Stars Meryl Streep. Has nothing to do with video games, but still a very good film, so like I liked it. Not all of my favorite films are going to be video game related, but... yeah, that one, whew. If it wasn't so hard to watch, it would probably be higher on my list. Next up, Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. Very good film. We talked about that one already. Some of the best that Star Trek has to offer. And then finally, honorable mention, The Thing. The Thing, I would probably like it more if I was a bigger fan of body horror, but I'm not a fan of body horror. It's kind of... Sorry about that. A lot of weird cuts today. The Thing, like I said, I'm not a huge fan of body horror. Everything else about the film is really good for me. So if it wasn't for the body horror aspect of it, which just really isn't my style, it would be one of my favorite films of the year. It might, I don't know, it'd be up there with Blade Runner, but the special effects are so wonky for me. Like I said, body horror is just not my thing, so it just doesn't work for me, and I have to put it as an honorable mention. But other than the body horror, the film's great. I love the film. All right, let's get into platforms. Favorite computer. We'll start there. Favorite computer, I'm going to give it to the Atari 800, I think, this year. To be honest, this is going to be the last year that we do the favorite computer because it's so hard to keep track of what games are available for what computer in what year. The ports from computer system to computer system are almost impossible to track. I can barely keep track of when a computer game was initially released. So when it went from, I don't know, the Apple II to the Atari 800 to the Commodore 64 to... It's so difficult to keep track that it's almost impossible for me to say what games were available in any one year. But the Atari 800, I feel at this point, has the game library and the power. It has a mix of both of those. The Commodore 64, like there's clearly more powerful computers. Commodore 64 comes to mind, but by the end of 1982, there's not a lot of games for the Commodore 64. So it's not going to be my favorite this year simply because the games aren't there yet. They get there eventually, but they're not there yet. But we're going to go ahead and retire this category, not only because it's so difficult to track the games libraries for each of these, but because the names of the computers themselves are pretty much going to stop being important in 1983. And we're going to start talking about software a lot more in 1983. So Atari 800 for now, and that's it for the computers, at least in terms of named computers. Favorite console? I'm going to give it to the ColecoVision. It should be the Atari 2600, let's be honest. But should you have the money, the ColecoVision can play everything on the Atari 2600 with an add-on. So that is definitely where I go. It's the more powerful machine. It's got its own games library, which isn't that extensive, but since it can play the entire Atari 2600, as soon as it comes out, it is better than the Atari 2600 by default. And the Atari 2600 is the only one with really a library of games that is worth mentioning. We talked about that in the honorable mentions video. There's over 100 games for the Atari 2600. I think the highest competitor next is like 30 something. Like it's so much better. There might even be over 200. I don't remember, but there's so many games for the Atari 2600 and nobody else has anything else. So whatever can play the Atari 2600 games, that's going to win. And the ColecoVision can do that and play its own games. So it wins. There you go. All right, let's get into video games themselves. Game that aged the worst. For me, it's going to be Yar's Revenge. I don't mean that this is the worst game of the year that we play. That's not what this category is. We're starting with the worst games, but game that aged the worst is the largest fall, the largest difference between when the game came out and what people thought of it and what the game is now and what people think of it now. And for me, Yar's Revenge had the largest drop. And that's why I say it aged the worst. It was considered one of the best games of the year. But for me, the graphics are odd, the story is strange, and the gameplay is counterintuitive. The graphics, we can start there. He's just displaying raw code on the screen. And saying that's the explosion. Maybe it looked good at the time. I can't say, but I mean, based on what I have seen, it doesn't look very good. It definitely doesn't look good now. But even then, it looks a little off. In terms of the story, it's just kind of weird. You play one alien race going against another alien race, and the graphics don't really show that to you. You have to read the manual to figure that out. There's so much reading involved, and that's not what you want from a 2600 game. I've mentioned it several times before. It's one of the reasons that Howard Scott Warshaw, his later games failed, because he kept on making things complicated. Like it's an Atari 2600 game. It's Atari 2600 is essentially a glorified toy in 1982. It's something that you pick up, play for 15 minutes, and then put down and pick up a different toy, pick up a Barbie or something. So Yar's Revenge aged the worst. The gameplay, like I said, it's counterintuitive. You're shooting this thing at the other side of the screen, and it's shooting back at you. But what you're supposed to do is go over and nibble at it, and that gives you the power to launch the actual laser that defeats it. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It's an odd game. And as a result, I think it aged poorly, especially in an era of shooters. There's so many better shooters out there. It was held well at the time, but by today's standards, it's just an odd game, and it's more associated it's more likely to be associated with E.T. because of Howard Scott Warshaw than it's supposed to be associated with being a good game at this point. Most disappointing game. This is basically the game that was supposed to be really good, but playing it was not. And for me, that's Ultima 2. Right, obviously it's not, I wouldn't say it's the worst game. I would say that E.T. was a worse game than Ultima 2, but Ultima 2 was so disappointing to me because it was supposed to be a sequel to Ultima 1, and I loved Ultima 1. We get to Ultima 2, and they ruined it, it felt like. They ruined all the things that made Ultima 1 good. They stripped away from Ultima 2 while adding a whole bunch of stuff that didn't work. From the maps not working, from like 90% of the game being optional, which can be good, don't get me wrong, but there was no point in going out and getting it. It's not like you get levels. It's not like you get quests. You're just going out and exploring for nothing. So what's the point of going out there? There was so much wrong that added up to having a bad time compared to the original game that Ultima 2 has to be the most disappointing game for me. All right, most surprising game. Most surprising game for me is Dragon Stomper. Dragon Stomper turned out to be a really good game for the time. A legitimate RPG. I would say it was a better RPG than Ultima 2. And that's sad. Like, there was so much to Ultima 2, so much programming, so much care went into it, and then Dragon Stomper just comes along, and an Atari 2600 game turned out to be one of the best RPGs of the year. Might have been the best RPG for me. And it's short. It's kind of short and sweet, right? But the graphics weren't there, but the gameplay was, and I was very happy to play that and actually get a chance to show that off. So yeah, that was very surprising to me. I didn't have high expectations of that game, and it exceeded them quite a bit. So yeah, that was surprising to me. Next up, favorite console game. Dragon Stomper's up there, right? It was very good. Let me look at my list again. There weren't a lot of console games out there. Yar's Revenge was one. Of course, we have all the ports that I'm not talking about, but that's because I don't like talking about ports and making them best games if there's originals. Demon Attack. There's not a lot. Pitfall. And River Raid. Those are our lists. So, like, Dragon Stomper's up there, but I'm going to give it to Pitfall. Like, I did have this written down before, but I was like, what is my list? There's not a lot. Pitfall turned out to be my favorite console game. It's a fun adventure. It's something you can easily pick up and play and understand, but it's deep enough that you're going to have to learn a lot of the individual mechanics as you go along. So it's definitely a game worth checking out, and definitely worth playing, and the best console game of the time. Not the best seller. I think it ended up selling better than E.T., but it didn't sell as well as Pac-Man. But it's so much better than Pac-Man. Play Pitfall. It's good. Favorite computer game. There were a lot more computer games this year than there were in the past. Once again, let's look through the list of games that are available. First one was Deadline, Moon Patrol. I think that was a computer game. Choplifter, Wizardry 2, Robotron 2084, Miner 2049er. Is that it? No. Zork 3, Ultima 2, The Hobbit, and that is it. All right. So of those, I'm going to give it to Deadline. Of all of them, Deadline was the one that surprised me the most. It was the one that I had the most fun playing. It's the only one that I would think I could go back to. I really had high hopes for The Hobbit, but it was just a little too off. Deadline, it was a nice little package, and even though things moved by themselves the same way that they did in The Hobbit, it wasn't going to break your game. You could lose because of it, but you would still have to know to let things go. Like, you had to intentionally let things go so badly that you lost. So Deadline for me was definitely the best computer game of the year. Once again, one of the ones that kind of surprised me because I didn't know about it until I did research, but it definitely turned out to be pretty good, and I recommend it. Then we have Xevious. Xevious is going to be my best arcade game of the year. It was only a matter of time before arcades started getting colorful, and that's one of the reasons Xevious made the list. There were a lot of arcade games that we're not going to talk about, but I feel that it brought close to the technical prowess of Pole Position, but in a much more fleshed out and enjoyable game. Pole Position is just too short. So that was the closest one for me. Xevious became my favorite arcade game. It turned out to be a lot of fun, and you can see the influence that it ended up having. Favorite overall game, we're going to give that to Deadline. Deadline turned out to be the best game for me this year. We've talked about all the aspects of it. It's a murder mystery. It's a lot of fun trying to solve a case. Best game of the year. So those are my awards for the year. Sorry about another strange cut. Everyone's stressed around here, including the animals. So those are my awards for the year. Let's take a look at what Electronic Games Magazine gave the awards to. They're still doing, video games of the year. And I feel like it's worth mentioning just to kind of give an aspect of, this is what the critics say, or this is what at least one small set of the critics say. And it kind of gives an insight into what they were thinking at the time. All right, so for arcades, I gave it to Xevious, which they might not have known about, but I definitely wouldn't have given to the one they gave it to. They gave it to Tron. Like I said, nobody really talks about Tron anymore. That's what I said when I talked about it before. It's 4 mini games. None of them are particularly fun for me, I would say. So I'm kind of surprised to see that one here. The console ones, they're much closer, I think. They gave it to Demon Attack. I feel that is a good game. That one actually, I understand. Like, if you say that Demon Attack is your favorite game of the year, I'll understand. They're big on shooters, and it's a good example of a shooter. For computers, though, I have no idea where they're coming from. They gave it to a game that we haven't even talked about. It's called David's Midnight Magic, and it's a pinball game. They gave it to a pinball game. Let's look back at the list of computer games that came out. There's Deadline, which I gave it to. Moon Patrol, once again, I'm 50-50 on whether that is one. Choplifter. There's Wizardry 2. Robotron 2084. No, Robotron 2084 is still an arcade game at the time. Miner 2049er. There's Zork 3. Ultima 2. The Hobbit. And they gave it to a pinball game. I'm not a big fan of pinball. That's why we haven't talked about pinball. In fact, there were 2 Pac-Man pinball games that came out this year in 1982 that I just didn't talk about, and some people consider it part of the Pac-Man franchise, including one called Baby Pac-Man, inspired by the TV show, that is half pinball and half video game, they say, but I've played it. It's about 90% pinball, and then a small little thing on the screen that kind of replicates Pac-Man. It's not that good. It's not really a video game. But I'm not a huge fan of pinball. I'm decent at it, don't get me wrong, but it's just not my thing. But for them to give a computer game of the year award to a pinball game when there's so many other good games this year, that's crazy to me. All right, so that is the awards. Let's take a look at contributions from patrons. What do the patrons have to say? First, we'll start with Alex Jones. Alex Jones says, well, 1982 was certainly a packed year. Can't say I have any experiences with these games. This was still several years before I was born. Me too, but I went back and played them. As to my favorite game, I'd have to give it to Deadline. It was quite complex that required you to work out the murderer. The solution was quite clever, where there were actually 2 culprits you had to accuse to win the game. There are some other notable games like Ultima 2, which had some good features like detailed towns, but had too many issues to be considered a game of the year for me. Ultima 2 also didn't cut it. It was just too... I think you mean Wizardry 2. Wizardry 2 also didn't cut it. It was just too similar to the first game and made little attempt to innovate. The Hobbit certainly had big ambitions, but it just fell apart due to rampant bugs. Don't really have a worse game. There were a lot of them, and can't really pick out one that was worse than all the rest. Looking forward to 1983, quite interesting for reasons that will become apparent. There is not as many video games released this year, but there will still be some notable game releases. Yeah, 1982 is not going to be as big of a year. It's hard to disagree with most of what you said here. 1983, not going to be as big of a year in terms of pure number of games that we're going to talk about. The first thing that we're going to talk about is why that is. And I'm sure people that have done any sort of research into video games and the history of video games will know that 1983 is an important year, and we'll talk about why that is. Next up, we have Mike Lindgren. As a kid, we had an Atari port of Moon Patrol that I played a ton. All the other games I didn't play at all, or not until later in life. As with previous years, it's really cool to see the origins of so many game genres as they come, like Miner 2049er in platforming, or the Wizardry Ultima games and RPGs. I think the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons game was a real waste of an opportunity to make a cool RPG instead of a generic action game, but at least the game was interesting. All in all, a lot of very interesting games. Looking forward to 83. So Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, it does feel like a waste a bit because you had the biggest RPG franchise name out there and they turned it into an action game. It does have a bit of an adventure to it, like the console game Adventure from 1979, 1980. It has a bit of that to it. So like they were still a little weird on what the RPG genre actually looked like, but yeah, it just felt like they missed it with that one for me. Next up, we have Joe B. 1982 was a great building year for RPG and narrative games. There were superior sequels to Zork, Wizardry, Ultima, and more. I disagree. New games pushed what could be done at the time, with Deadline incorporating feelies and The Hobbit having AI-controlled NPCs. I swear Gandalf isn't usually that bad. Yeah, Deadline and The Hobbit both had the NPCs that would move without you. And Deadline did have the feelies. You had to have something to help you solve the case that came separate from the game itself. It wasn't part of the manual. It was a physical thing that you had to have. And that was partly to reduce copyright, but also to kind of get around the storage limitations of a computer game. I'd say my game of the year is Ms. Pac-Man. It's such a perfect, timeless game. It's hard to argue with that one. Runner-ups would be AD&D for melding rogue and adventure into a tight bundle, and Sogo Band for its staying power in so many other games as the original block-pushing puzzle game. Yeah, AD&D, like, it's not necessarily the style that I was hoping for, and possibly that's what's making me say that it's worse than it actually is. It does have, like, some adventure in it, but I don't really see rogue in it. I don't see a lot of that game in there. And then Sogo Band, which we haven't talked about too much. I did do some streams on it. I mentioned it in an honorable mention video. I wanted to do a full video and full playthrough of Sogo Band. There were two problems with it because it is a good game. One, I can't find any information on the creation of the game. All I can find is a company name and a year. That's it. That's all I can find. So the company's name is Thinking Rabbit. It was released in 1982. That's all I got. But number two, the puzzles are so long and so difficult. Like I mentioned, there's 50 puzzles, and I was streaming them. And one time it took me over an hour just to solve one puzzle. And I think I ended up having to look up the answer anyway. For somebody that hasn't played it, it's going to be intense. Or doesn't have a guide. It's going to be very difficult to solve it. It's so difficult and it takes so long. You have to think 100, 200 steps in advance. You have to think entire like mini puzzles in advance to try to figure out, okay, I solved this mini puzzle, but did I solve it in the right way so that I can like basically undo that solve later? It's so difficult. It started giving me a headache trying to think so far in advance, you know, trying to think 200 moves in advance and then trying to implement it and then figuring out, you know what, I'm wrong. And sometimes it would take you like 15, 20 minutes to find out that you made a mistake. Like it was so difficult. So those two reasons I didn't turn it into a full video, but it's still a very good game and so influential. And we will see more from Sogo Band later, and I'll reference it all the time. We're going to see a lot of games that incorporate this block pushing mechanic into it, just not at the difficulty level of Sogo Band. All right, back to Joe's comment here. I hope you have more fun and less buggy time with the games, like what happened with Ultima 2. Looking forward to another great building year and unbuilding year of 1983. Yeah, overall, it was still fun. Just, yeah, there were frustrations with Ultima 2, some with The Hobbit, because the games were kind of glitchy at certain points. So it became difficult for me to get into a lot of it, but ultimately in Ultima, I just felt bad that I wasn't able to show things off. That was the hardest part for me, was not being able to show things off. So Speaking of the patrons, I want to give a big thank you to all of my patrons. Those are Alex Jones, Veronica Gross, Lymanity, Squirrel Dash, Daniel, Joe B, and Mike Lindgren. Thank you guys so much. If you do want to help support the videos and the channel as a whole, Patreon is the best way to do that. Links are always in the description below. But that is enough for Patreon for now. So let's look forward to 1983. Like I've mentioned, and like one of the patrons mentioned, many of you already know what is coming in 1983. That's going to come in its own video. It's going to be the first one after the cultural context video. It's literally named The Blank of 1983. So a lot of people know that it's coming. We will talk about it. We will address it. But keep in mind, it's not a sudden event. It actually takes place over 3 years. So we're going to talk about the initial impacts. We're going to talk about the cause, and then we'll kind of keep an eye on it as we continue. One of the things I want to talk about is a lot of people exaggerate it a ton. And other people say that it didn't really happen at all. So I'm going to try to get to the truth of the matter and try to give that without giving too much opinion. Just trying to say this is what causes it to happen. This is what happened. This is the impact. And we'll keep an eye on that as we keep going. Overall, we do have less games to look at in 1983 than 1982. It's going to be a down year, and that's one of the reasons we're going to talk about what we talked about. I believe I mapped out that I had around 30 right now, 30 30 topics, I should say, that we're going to talk about, as opposed to over 40 with 1982. And I'm still probably going to cut some in 1983 a bit. Some games aren't going to work out, stuff like that. So we're looking at 30 right now, give or take, topics. And we'll see what we can do as we keep going. But it's going to be a shorter year. 1982 is actually the biggest year for a couple years. There was just so many things going on. 1983 is going to start condensing a bit. In terms of what we're going to talk about, we have some big names that are going to show up. A few that we have seen before, a couple that we haven't necessarily seen. And we're going to see what... here's a teaser for you. We're going to see the biggest spin-off series of all time start in 1983. We're going to see more sequels. In terms of actual gameplay types, we're going to continue to see a bigger variety. There's going to be a bigger variety in this year than we have seen in the past, than in terms of game types. In terms of game platforms, no, it's actually going to condense. But we're going to see some more innovation. I would say that we were lacking a lot of innovation in 1982. There were some games that innovated, but not as many, and definitely not as high of a percentage of innovation as we have seen before. We're going to see different styles of games coming out. And even though 1983 is going to be a smaller year for us, I anticipate seeing better games than 1982. Overall, I think that the games are going to be better, and I'm looking forward to that. So I hope you guys do look forward to 1983. I have no idea how long this video has gone. I just know that I've been recording for far too long, and the animals have not been helping too much with that. Hopefully this year will be better for me, both 1983 and 2022. Things have not been so good lately, but hopefully things turn around soon. So I hope you guys look forward to 1983. I've been Baller Scuba. This has been Video Games Over Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in 1983.